Our Western ideal is under great pressure, and we can do nothing to influence it.
You know, our sense of what matters is very single-minded.
We take refuge in our everyday lives and hide behind new borders. We can't seem to cope with a world in which we increasingly feel out of place. No wonder, says British historian Peter Frankopan, author of bestseller The Silkroads. We are the product of a history in which we have always given ourselves the leading role. As a result, we can't see the connection between our actions and the changes around us.
The key is to be able to adapt, to understand what's going on in the world around you, and not to resist it or to try to fight it or to think you can stop it, but to try to anticipate what happens next. What are the longer-term consequences?
Before we can understand where the world is headed, we need to look back. Frankopan holds up a mirror to us that clearly shows we will have to adapt. This is Backlight. Welcome to the crossroads of your history.
A new world order is being pushed together where, to an extent, it's not about excluding the West. The West, as it happens, is self-selecting out of it anyway. You know, we are navel-gazing, worrying about our own problems, and missing a world being formed as it does so because we don't pay any attention to what's going on. I think it's fair to say that we in the West believe that other people in the world should be more like us. We are very careful to tell other governments that they should follow our lead in terms of how they behave and the kinds of freedoms they give their citizens. That kind of cultural arrogance is not a deliberate choice. It's partly to do with the fact that it just doesn't cross our mind that it might be important or useful or even interesting to try to understand other people better.
Peter Frankopan is a descendant of Croatian nobility and director of the Centre for Byzantine Research at the University of Oxford. When he looks at history, he doesn't see a series of peaks, but long threads of development spanning the globe.
Normally in history, we look at small, narrow periods, small reigns, individual rulers, generals, and so on and so forth. And it's quite rare, I think, to try and look at big picture history, and particularly spanning continents, spanning over such a long period of time that I cover.
These are Frankopan's new silk routes. The route of slavery, the route of gold, the route of oil, the route of violence, and so on. Various events and developments spread across several continents and millennia are somehow interconnected and affecting one another. He argues that our ideas and behaviour are much more of the product of our ancestors' actions than we want to believe.
Well, so here's the part of the world I learnt about at school, here. But this is the middle of the world, here. And when I define who I am, I say I'm Caucasian, which is these mountain ranges here, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The Caucasus, this means something to us. Nobody really knows why. We talk about Indo-European languages. We sort of assume, and we know that we all came this way, and that we brought our languages. They're somehow connected to Sanskrit. You don't, even if you're not a linguist, you've heard this expression. All the things that I wanted to know about seem to come from here, both the Caucasus, but also where our religions came from. So Christianity and Judaism come from here. Islam comes from Mecca, Medina, but it spreads out in different directions. You know, we think of Europe as a Christian continent because of the Pope. Well, he's here. Or maybe the head of our church in Holland or Canterbury or wherever it might be. But the religion of Europe came from here.
You could say that Frankopan looks through the eyes of someone from another era, when traders from an emerging Europe set out to find riches along the old silk routes. He says these routes are still there, and our need for them will grow, because Asia and the Middle East are in the midst of determining our future. Recognizing the importance of this part of the world, and contrasting this with what he calls our one-sided worldview, his book ended up topping the bestseller lists in Asia and, yes, in Europe as well. The book's subtitle reads, A New History of the World.
We are absolutely convinced that, that we have a monopoly on goodness, and that we in Europe are the only ones capable of saving the world from darkness and from suffering. And increasingly, the parts of the world that I look at, the rising voice, I think, is one which says, well, the West has many Achilles' heels and should reevaluate its own contributions to global affairs and to interventions in these parts of the world, but also even in its own continent. That how did it go so badly wrong in the first half of the 20th century that these kind of events could happen? And so I think we in the West are tone deaf. Well, I think we're blind to other people's histories, and I think we're tone deaf to understanding how we look from the outside to others. And that stems from education, that stems from the kinds of assumptions that we have about the past, which seem to me a sort of tissue of very nice, pretty myths that make us feel good about ourselves without ever recognising the impacts we've had on others and what the significance and importance is of learning about others in the world around us.
De taak dat ik meeloop in deze patrouille is om de geneeskundige zorg af te dekken. In eerste instantie voor onze eigen mensen en in tweede instantie om snelle winst te maken bij de burgerbevolking, bijvoorbeeld door snelle wonden te verzorgen. En dan kweken we goodwill mee bij de burgerbevolking hier in dit gebied.
Whether solving conflicts, providing development aid or trading cheap products, wherever we go with our weapons, help or contracts, we apply our laws and values. And time again, we are surprised when our intentions and their results turn out to diverge from one another.
It's absurd to think about the world in European and Western terms. From the beginning of our story of history, Asia has been where all the centre has been. Doesn't take a great deal for us to join the dots together. So when you learn about ancient Greece, for example, the Greeks were really not preoccupied about people in Italy or France or Spain. The Greeks were obsessed about each other, Athens and Sparta, of course, but Greece's primary rival was Persia. That was the same profile with Rome as well, that having mopped up these tribal peoples in the forests of Europe, Rome's anchor and centre of gravity was all centred, and its prestige all centred on gaining traction on trade routes through the Red Sea and the Gulf, but then across land routes into Asia as well, because Europe is at the wrong end of these great global trade routes.
Of course, we know the cradle of our civilization isn't in Europe, but in the Middle East. But according to Frankopan, we fail to see that this region, along with the rest of Asia, is making an unprecedented comeback. We shouldn't underestimate this development, because it is beyond our control. We are often fooled by its appearance, which can seem brash and slick to us.
Well, we think that it's all very vulgar, don't we? We think that these guys with their expensive gold-plated cars and giant buildings and gold taps and so on, that it's excessive. And it never crosses our mind that maybe when we built giant palaces coming out of the swamps in Venice, that's all in the eye of the beholder. And, it's better to be nouveau riche than nouveau poor, as I think we're going to find out in Europe, that it's easy to smirk and laugh about people because they spend their money in whichever way they want. And it stands to reason that at a certain point, when you are not given any validation or treated with any dignity, that things in the West, our world that looks so comfortable and good to us, starts to look smug and self-satisfied to others around us. And in due course, it might just be that we need the help of many of these countries, many of these people, whether it's to build our nuclear power plants here or to invest in businesses that keep Dutch workers and British workers in their jobs, but also in terms of trying to deal with big strategic problems in the world, being able to talk to peers in Moscow, in Tehran, in Dubai, in Riyadh, and so on and so forth, is absolutely essential. And we broadly leave that up to a couple of ambassadors and the odd foreign minister who disappears over there. But we I think, are setting ourselves up to completely misunderstand the world of the present and future. And we've misunderstood the world of the past.
Those who used to be poor are getting rich, very rich. Besides supplying our shops and warehouses, they now keep our companies in business and finance our debts. They are on their way to becoming the employers of the future, while we stand on the sidelines and look on passively, just as we did in the distant past.
Europe 1,000 years ago doesn't have a great deal to offer. The kinds of goods that can be sold and were sold, we have archaeological evidence of this too, are things like amber and heavy swords and falcons and birds of prey for hunting and so on. But Europe wasn't producing anything of mineral value or scholarly value. In fact, you have Arab geographers and writers 1,000 years ago saying, well, why was it that the Greeks, ancient Greeks, produced all these mathematicians who were able to understand the world and ask questions about physics, about astronomy, about medicine? Why is no one in Europe today interested or capable or competent? And the best answer they come up with is to say, well, it must be because Europe became Christian and Christians have no interest in exploration or in innovation. While the Muslim world took delight in innovation, progress and new ideas, much of Christian Europe withered in the gloom, crippled by a lack of resources and a dearth of curiosity. It's almost the precise opposite of the world as we see it today. The fundamentalists were not the Muslims, but the Christians. Those whose minds were open, curious and generous were based in the East, and certainly not in Europe. As one author put it, when it came to writing about non-Islamic lands, we did not enter them into our book because we see no use whatsoever in describing them. They were intellectual backwaters.
With the current situation in mind, it is hard to imagine, but in around 800 AD, what is now called Iraq and Iran was one of the wealthiest regions in the world, with Baghdad as the center of this wealth, the Paris of the Middle East. Wrong, Frankopan would say. Paris is the Baghdad of Europe. In any case, the Middle East was a place of progress, while Europe was still merely a place for exploitation, and its peoples, the best merchandise.
A city emerged in about the year 800, which for centuries drew in scholars, learning, and artisans, because this was the wealthiest part of the world. And you have books written and texts written 1,000 years ago where I suppose it's what you'd expect to find, guidebooks for how the rich should spend their money. Where would you find the best saddles? Where are the tastiest pomegranates? If you're rich, you want the best that money can buy. And that means everything from fruit to horses to saddles to stirrups to ceramics. The one commodity we had in Europe in very large numbers that we could trade were women and children. There was no greater time of the slave trade than a millennium ago, where the demand for young men and women and children in a rich, vibrant Islamic world was huge. The demand was enormous. Cities like Dublin and Mainz and Utrecht, and above all Venice, began their lives as slave trading centres. Venice were repeatedly warned by the Pope to stop selling slaves to Muslims.
These were the seeds for the double standard that would come to characterize our worldwide ventures, and whose tentacles would spread in all directions around the globe. Christian morality demands complete surrender in the name of God, and the world is split in two. But if there is money to be made, honestly or otherwise, God may not have a lot to do with it.
The knights and their writers and their chroniclers talk about heroism, they talk about God, they talk about crusades. Those who are a bit more sober think about the money and the profits available. And the Venetians and the Genoese particularly start to build up very substantial trading positions with Muslim traders. It's doing one thing and promising that you're serving God, but on the other hand, money talks.
Joining up the dots, solving the puzzle, that's what drives Frankopan. And he has no problem connecting up 1,000 years of history in a single sentence. His dots run from the Crusades to imperialism and back. And as of old, the now ever-industrious Europe is increasingly leaving its mark on the world without worrying too much about the consequences. The fact that saying and doing are two different things doesn't seem to matter.
Europe no longer is trading with India, the Portuguese and the Dutch no longer trading with the Spice Islands, but colonizing and conquering them, and doing the same process of extracting goods and money back towards Europe in return for nothing. This is at the time when human beings are being trafficked across the Atlantic, taken from Africa to work for free, because there's no better work than free work.
Free labour is a thing of the past, but the fact that we outsource our production of goods shows that the principle hasn't disappeared completely. Cheap is almost free, and the working conditions of those who produce for our market don't seem to be an issue, at least not to us.
We in the West generally have a default view, which is as long as it's not being made illegal, people should be able to do what they like and sell to whoever they like. And what the consequences of that is for broken families, for addictions, for cancer, for the health services, with armaments for breakouts of conflict in other parts of the world, potentially here in Europe too one day again. We don't think that there is a response because cash is king. That same profile happened after Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Columbus crossed with his sails painted red to mark the cross of Christ, and Columbus, driven by the almost fanatical desire to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim hands, very quickly the process in the Americas goes to extracting silver and bullion from the native populations. And that money enriches Europe in a way that helps spark the Renaissance. When Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, that gave the first moment for two new continents to be connected into global exchange. And that brought the peoples living in the Americas into contact with Europe, Africa, and Asia. That geographically meant that Europe became a central continent. While the Americas were separate to Africa, Europe, and Asia for millennia before then, despite the very minor contact with the Viking world, that repositioning at the centre was fundamental. But second, the causes that allowed Europe to discover routes across the Atlantic, and almost at exactly the same time, routes around the southern tip of Africa to reach India, those technological advantages that Europe had been busy trying to create for itself really were the result of the fact that Europe couldn't compete in other ways and shapes and forms. And so its ability to cultivate and systematize force and violence were hugely important parts of Europeans' success and of Europeans' desire to constantly innovate. The gold and the silver particularly, but also the jewels of the Americas were brought back to Europe by the cartload. The gold was stored like wheat, one account says, and there was so much of it. And that redistribution of assets from the Americas primarily to Europe, but then recycled through to Asia, because what the Europeans did with that sudden surge of wealth was to buy goods that came from Asia, textiles, spices, ceramics. And so that money starts to find its way being sent around the world through proper globalized trading patterns. Fighting, violence, and bloodshed were glorified as long as they could be considered just. This was one reason, perhaps, why religion became so important. There could be no better justification of war than it being in defense of the Almighty. From the outset, the fusion of religion and expansion were closely bound together. Even the sails of Columbus's ships were marked by large crosses. It was all part of God's plan for the West to inherit the earth.
So God's plan has been fulfilled quite well. In his book, Frankopan devotes several hundred pages to the European appropriation of the world and the structural violence that came with it. The 20th century wasn't much different, especially after the discovery of oil. There are roughly 500 years between the gold stolen from the Americas by the Spanish and the Portuguese and the black gold in the Middle East. But the mechanisms of conquest and seizure haven't changed.
Amazing, and this is directly linked to the modern world. This is the birth origin of British petroleum. The oil find in Persia and then later on in Mesopotamia were on the scale of the discovery of routes across the Atlantic by Columbus. European industry was rapidly growing, and the need and the desire to make them more efficient in terms of what fuels were burnt, the demand was enormous. During the course of the First World War, the oil fields were described by the British government as a first-class war aim. So we think of the First World War as being to do with the trenches and the warfare in the Somme and the suffering on the Eastern Front, but even during the First World War, what happened in the centre of the world shaped decisions that were made that are playing out today. The creation of a state of Iraq, boundaries that are those of modern Syria, ultimately the creation of the state of Israel. All of these things were all connected to the need to protect those and secure those oil supplies, and likewise the arteries that brought them back to Europe.
The borders in the Middle East were drawn according to our oil interests. Despite the existence of independent states in the region, the extent of Western appropriation is unrivaled. Oil was and is the new gold and attracts the kind of people drawn to the prospect of quick success.
The vultures of world commerce descend on Zaide's little kingdom. They're perfectly decent vultures, just bankers and businessmen doing their job. $100 million a year is a nice piece of export market to get your hands on, especially when the place so obviously needs your help.
We've been here before. Well, there's been quite some improvement here in 4 years since I've been here. I fully expect to see some floor shows when I get on into town.
With some striptease also?
Well, no, that's a little too much.
The modern world, our world, is taking over. I remember, for instance, not long ago, when there wasn't a single bank in Abu Dhabi. Now, these buildings are all banks.
Control of those resources have always given a very difficult series of balances, which is that it's in the interests of the oil exporters from the West to pay as little as possible to get the fuel out of the ground and to keep as much of the profits and money as possible, and to give as little back on to the local concerns.
Like most people of the Middle East, Mustafa wants the benefits of mechanized civilization. Change is coming as the great natural resources of Iran are developed. The most important resource is oil. At Abadan is one of the world's largest refineries, built to serve customers of many nations. Developed by British interests, Iranian oil has been the subject of bitter dispute.
The wrangling with Iran has made the country a prime example of the way the old allies from the West tried to exert their influence on the region. The old agreements, for instance the United Kingdom's 60-year monopoly on the exploitation of all Iranian oil, have sparked deep frustration and resistance.
Almost as soon as oil starts to flow through pipelines and brought by tanker back to Europe, the local populations start screaming and shouting that their share of the profits of this black gold are not fair or correct. And it's not long before the population in Iran in particular starts to become extremely vocal about the fact that the West is taking all of the benefits and there is nothing to show for it domestically. When money is grudgingly returned back to local rulers and to the Shah, it's put into the hands of the few rather than to the hands of the many. And the more corrupt and the more venal, the more the richer that the wealthy become, the easier they are to deal with and the easier they are to buy from businesses abroad. And soon that oil money is being recycled. The money that's coming back to places like Iran is being used to buy weapons, eventually to buy nuclear technologies on a scale that is mind-blowing. And that process of always having a cycle where Europe sits at the centre, taking what it needs, and then giving back almost poison to make sure that the world becomes more destabilised, poses some very important questions about Europe's rise and about Europe's present and also about its future.
The game is far from over. As the Cold War progresses, the creativity used to manipulate strategic partners in the Middle East rises to new heights. Weapons go on discount, and yes, even nuclear energy is sold over the counter. Anything to keep strategic friends happy.
The United States would be more than willing. It would be proud to take up with others principally involved the development of plans whereby such peaceful use of atomic energy would be expedited.
Atoms for peace was the American response to the fear of Soviet influence in the region. Nuclear power plants and technological knowledge supplied in order to command and confirm friendship, and despotic leaders like the Shah supported in exchange for loyalty and oil. Regardless of the consequences should that loyalty come to an end.
Iran was the sort of the pivot on which US policy was based, and therefore the goods and the products and the benefits were shown lavishly to the Shah. And of course that then changed when there was a change of regime, and suddenly the Iranians went from being trusted to have nuclear technology with being demonized for even daring to think about having nuclear technology, even though the programs were all built on US technology. The way in which the nuclear program took place was almost says everything about how foolish we were to think that people would never quite, that there were never any problems that would come down the line to face us.
The Western business plan for the Middle East is boomerang-like, flying back in our faces. Some old allies now foster ambitions of creating their own nuclear weapon. And whether realistic or not, this provides a good argument when demanding a new foreign policy.
The evolution of Saddam Hussein wanting a nuclear device was all driven directly by his experience in the 1980s, where he found out that the Americans had been selling weapons to his deadly enemies in Iran during the Iran-Iraq War at a time when they were supposed to be supporting Iraq. The process of not understanding what the consequences will be, led to the fact that after the first Gulf War, when Saddam was left in power, the idea, which we get from his audio recordings underneath Saddam Hussein's palace in Baghdad, found thousands of hours of audio tapes. He recorded everything, like all paranoid, schizophrenic dictators might be expected to do. And his conclusion is, if we have just one nuclear warhead, people in the West will think we're crazy enough to use it, and therefore will leave us alone. So there was an attempt. There was almost a cold logic in this idea to try to disengage with disastrous, self-serving double dealing of the West.
Where's the boss? There, he's gonna be.
We are literally the legal government for Iraq. In effect, I'm the #2 official in the Coalition Provisional Authority, and that makes me, if you will, the Vice President of Iraq. We've arrived at the palace of Saddam Hussein. This area is called the Rotunda. I don't know if you can shoot the dome above us. It's pretty impressive. All the inscriptions on the walls up above and around us are all remnants from Saddam. Praising himself. This is formerly Saddam's office. I've heard about this room. I've never actually been in it before, but you can see it's got a lot of unopened bottles of wine and Johnny Walker Blue Label. There's looks like a case of Remy Martin. Well, they had quite a life for themselves while they ruled.
We have just not understood how this part of the puzzle all fits together. We treat individual rulers, individual regions, individual ideas as separate, rather than joining up into the big picture. And we're living in a world in transition, nowhere more obvious than in Iraq, Syria, and so on, where a lot of the things we're seeing are unpicking problems that have been and traps that have been set up by the West over the last century or more.
These are parts of the great story in which the West plays the leading role, but depending on your perspective, it has not always been the role of the hero. We can only conclude that the marks left on the world by our domination of it are deeper and wider than we would care to admit.
That kind of venal behavior where you stuff your own pockets does have consequences. It had consequences in the Americas and after the conquistadors, where people like Cortés told the Native American people that he had a disease that only could be cured with gold. It has consequences with the banking system, which brought the global economy to its knees. It brought the European and Western interventions in the Middle East. It's directly led to the rise of fundamentalist regimes and fundamentalist ideas. Actions have consequences. The problem about taking decisions that are unsustainable and too good to be true is that they turn out to come back and destroy and haunt.
This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while.
أقول أن المعركة هي ليست بين تنظيم القاعدة والصليبية العالمية. المعركة بين الإسلام، بين أهل الإسلام وبين الصليبية العالمية.
Well, you know, the language of the video tells you everything you need to know about the complete failure of the West to understand the East. I mean, even talking about the Crusades, you know, bin Laden is choosing a word that is extremely loaded in the Arabic-speaking world, in the Muslim world, where a crusade is a byword for duplicity, for men to use their beliefs as a screen to get what they wanted, in terms of wealth, trade, and so on and so forth. Whereas, of course, in the West, we think of the Crusades as a period of great glory, of men fighting, committing acts of violence for their belief in God. And even today, the crusade is a very positive word in our language. The Crusades left a very specific scar on the Middle East in terms of the perceived attempts to try to make an intervention and colonize and refuse to share and cooperate. And so Bush's choice of words after 9/11 of saying that the US would act and lead effectively another crusade to get what it wanted and to bring justice and revenge for 9/11 was almost the single worst word that he could possibly have used. Not just to Western ears that think of the Crusades as a bygone age and it's a clumsy analogy, but it's a particularly provocative thing to say, a thoughtless thing to say, that just underlined the idea, I think, that the West not only places its own interests first, but also completely doesn't understand the world into which it's stepping into.
From the European swamps, via the slave trade, the Crusades, the discovery of America and the race for oil, to the war in Afghanistan. It's a head-spinning journey through time along the ancient Silk routes. But if we refuse to see the connections between all these events and everything in between, we can't determine where we stand, how the world sees us, and where we are headed.
If you are Russian or Iranian or Southeast Asian or India and Pakistan or China, and you're trying to see what role it is that the West plays in the world in terms of its political balancing power, in terms of its trade and so on and so forth, the West, measured by its results, doesn't look particularly effective right now. You know, it looks like when we intervene, we get it wrong. We're particularly bad at making new friends. We talk about ourselves putting ourselves first and having new trade deals and breaking down barriers. I think we see how the world is now going to emerge. I mean, it looks like the pattern is coming where isolationism and self-interest take centre stage. So the key chanting line during Trump's election and after his inauguration is about America first. Leave other people to themselves and let them kill each other if they need to. The increasing noise and voices I hear across Asia are that Asia is its own backyard and that the problems that will get dealt with need to be dealt with and looked at regionally. And that includes current discussions about Syria being held in Kazakhstan with delegates from Russia, from Iran, from China, but no one from the West. This is a world where the United States and Europe have made their bed and can lie in it, and in any event, what purpose is there trying to involve them in solving problems that are regional and perceived to be local? So these new blocks that are knitting together are ones that are finding ways of trying to collaborate and to talk to each other and to find ways of solving problems mutually. The transfer of wealth from the West towards the East over the last 3 decades has been monumental in scale. The size of GDP distribution across the rest of the world, away from Europe and from the States, has been vast, to the point that Trump is right that China has grown at the expense of American mill workers and fabric workers. Pipelines that have been built, train lines being built, the digital revolution is having an enormous impact on parts of the world where 60% of the population live.
We will have to get used to it. We are less and less needed, whether we like it or not. The choice is ours, stay in the game or not. But entrenching ourselves, says Frankopan, will get us nowhere.
The good news, I suppose, is that golden ages never end in an explosion. You know, there's never a sort of dramatic collapse. You know, Europe will sag slowly and, you know, gently to its knees, and there's no shame in that. You know, it's a bit like, I suppose, a once wealthy family that had a beautiful castle or palace, and life has become tougher. They used to have 50 butlers and servants when you'd have dinner there, and then, you know, you notice that there are fewer people serving you and opening the door when you arrive, and now the lady of the house does the cooking as well, and, you know, then you can see the plaster coming off the walls a little bit, and, you know, but it still speaks about the past, and it's a beautiful property. And I think that's what Europe is like, that we are, you know, we have much to be proud of, the cultural achievements, the scientific achievements and so on of the recent centuries, that we have a very proud past as well. You know, it's not important not just to focus on the highly negative interventions in other parts of the world, but the fundamentals are that we will have less and less money. We have already a widening redistribution of the rich and the poor, which looks to me much more like the medieval world that Europe once was, where you have barons. Today it's hedge fund managers. 1,000 years ago, it was you know, lords in their castles. Today, it's hedge fund managers with their underground cellars with their fleet of Lamborghinis and Ferraris, and life becoming tougher and tougher. They do have a lot of tourists coming to visit us. They have a lot of students coming to study in, for example, in my university. And the wave is almost only in one direction. We don't send many students at all to study in India or in China or in Russia. The children of the elite and of the middle classes from all these countries, they do know how to have cucumber sandwiches and what we listen to and what's the best way to have fun in the Fondle Park at the weekend. They do know that because they travel. The visits coming here from other parts of the world and wealthy parts of the world, it's huge and rising, and to me looks like Europeans or British and Dutch travelling to Venice or to Rome or to Florence 200 years ago, seeing these once great cities that have started to decay and, you know, having pictures of themselves made in front of the Colosseum and saying, well, once upon a time this was the global centre of power. One day people will walk down the Kaisersgracht here and will point at those buildings and say, people really spent millions to buy this kind of property? Could they not see that the world was changing? Could they not see that Asia and Southeast Asia were rising in terms of their economies? And did they not think to prepare? And, well, I can tell you, the citizens of Venice didn't think about preparing until it was too late. You can waste your time, waste your money, and run out of resources, and those ages, they come to a slow, relatively dignified end, and that's what the West is going through right now. In Western Europe and in the United States right now, according to the Gini index, as measured by the World Bank, you are statistically have a worse chance of staying where you are on the bottom of society than if you were born in Niger or Kazakhstan or Sierra Leone, you know, because the dice are weighted against you. And those are classic signs of societies that are entering into a phase of decay. That's what happened in Rome in the 4th century when the Huns started to attack. The criticisms were all that the sons of the wealthy spent all their times at the bathtub talking about, well, they didn't talk about models and film stars, but talking about who they were having liaisons with and about which are the most fanciable women in Rome, rather than getting stuck into the administration of what was at the empire. At the hour of need, people put their own self-interests first. And that was the same story in the Crusades when Jerusalem fell. There was a half-hearted attempt to recover it by the Christians, but it fell with a whimper. Constantinople, likewise, when it was attacked, no one lifted a finger, because in the grand scheme of things, better to butter your own bread than think about the wider community. It's all about how do you adapt for the world around you. You know, there's a fantastic quote by one of my favourite One of my favourite quotes in my book is in the opening, written by a king of Zhao in northwestern China in 300 or so BC. And he says, the ways of yesterday are not enough to understand the world of today. The key is to be able to adapt, to understand what's going on in the world around you, and not to resist it or to try to fight it or to think you can stop it, but to try to anticipate what happens next. What are the longer-term consequences? In the same way that what would you do if you're in Venice when news came through that Vasco da Gama had found a way to India? One man took to the roof of the palace and shouted down that we're doomed in Venice. And he was broadly right. It took a century for the doom and the decay to kick in. But what should you do? And that's the crossroads that we're at now.
Ich hoffe, dass Ihnen das Video gefallen hat. Klicken Sie hier, um das empfohlene Video anzusehen. Bitte abonnieren Sie unseren Kanal, um Updates über VPRO Dok zu erhalten.